Hello everyone, welcome to Marco's BL Love. Please enjoy this video.
The last thing I remember before the darkness took me was the snow swallowing my hands. I had stopped feeling them an hour ago, maybe 2. My fingers had gone numb first, then my feet, then the part of me that still believed anyone was coming. The wind had no name for what it did to a body left alone in it. I had been walking for 6 hours through a storm that the mountain did not care about, through a cold that had already decided I was not leaving. I was 23 years old, an Omega with nowhere left to go, and I was dying in the prettiest silence I had ever heard. Then something enormous moved through the trees, and the last thought I had before I lost consciousness was that whatever it was, it smelled like cedar and warm earth, and it smelled like safety. If you want to hear the uncensored, too hot for YouTube version of this story, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Welcome to BL Story Heaven. I hope you all are doing great. If you are new here, please hit the subscribe button for more stories. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy today's story. There is a particular kind of cold that does not announce itself. It does not come in with fanfare or howling fury. It settles. It is patient. It finds the places where warmth has been living quietly inside a body, and it crowds them out, one by one, the way a tide removes sand, slowly, thoroughly, without apology. That is the cold I was dying in when Roan found me. I should begin at the beginning, because the ending would mean nothing without it. My name is Kale. I was born in the lowland city of Varel, where the winters were cold but manageable, and the streets smelled of fish markets and iron forges and the particular exhaustion of people who worked with their hands. My mother was a seamstress. My father was not a subject I had the vocabulary for even now, years later. He had been the kind of alpha who believed that an Omega son was a mistake the universe had made specifically to embarrass him, and he had communicated this belief clearly and consistently throughout my childhood, mostly through silence, sometimes through other means. I left his house at 17 with 2 changes of clothing, a sewing kit my mother pressed into my hands at the door while he watched from the window without expression, and the particular brand of damage that only a parent can install in a child, the kind that does not look like damage from the outside because it is so perfectly fitted to the shape of who you are. For 6 years after that, I survived. That is the honest word for what I did. I survived in a series of rented rooms in a series of cities, working stitching and alterations for tailors who paid poorly but consistently, keeping to myself, asking for very little, receiving approximately that much. I was not unhappy exactly. I was the thing that comes before happiness has been imagined. I was functional. I was careful. I had constructed a life from the leftover materials of other lives, and I kept it neat, and I did not examine it too closely. Then I met Soren. Soren was an alpha. This is the first thing anyone noticed about him because he occupied a room the way weather occupies a room, filling it, changing the pressure of it, making everything else arrange itself around him without appearing to try. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark auburn hair that he wore too long for the fashion of the lower city, and eyes the color of deep amber, almost brown in shadow, almost gold in light. He smelled of pine resin and something warmer underneath, something that my Omega instincts had catalogued before my conscious mind had finished forming an opinion. He came into the tailoring shop where I worked on a Tuesday in early autumn, and he needed a coat altered. He came back on Thursday to collect it. He came back the following Monday for no reason I could identify, and he stayed for 2 hours, and by the time he left I had agreed to have dinner with him on Friday, which was something I had not done with anyone in 4 years. What Soren gave me, in the beginning, was the experience of being seen. Not the way my father had seen me, as a disappointment with legs. Not the way employers saw me, as a useful pair of hands attached to a manageable problem. He saw me the way you see a person when you have decided that person matters, when you are paying the kind of attention that makes the person being watched feel that their existence is not merely tolerated, but actively wanted. He asked questions about the things I thought, and not just the things I did. He remembered small details. He brought me books he thought I would enjoy, which I did. He laughed at things I said, genuinely, from the belly, Not the polished social laugh that alphas use to manage omegas, but the real kind, the kind that surprised him as much as it surprised me. I fell in love with him over the course of 8 months. By the 9th month, I had moved into his apartment in the mid-city district, into a life that felt warmer and larger than anything I had been allowed to imagine for myself, and I had begun, carefully, slowly, like a person removing bandaging from a wound to check if it is healed, to believe that this was real, that it was mine, that I was allowed to have it. The night everything ended, there was a dinner party at the apartment of Soren's business partner, a man named Fenn, who had the particular quality of someone who has always had money and has thus never needed to develop a personality. The apartment was on the upper floors of a building in the New Quarter, all glass and cold light. I did not enjoy these events. Soren's world was full of people who spoke in the currency of connections and acquisitions, and I was always aware, in those rooms, of being a lowland seamstress's son standing in a borrowed coat, which was actually a very good coat because I had made it myself, but which did not change what I was or where I had come from. I had gone to find the kitchen for a glass of water, moving through the back corridor away from the main party, when I heard them. 2 voices, low and male and intimate, in the particular way of people who believe they are not being overheard. The first voice was Soren's. The second voice I recognized, after a moment, as belonging to Aldrich, a man Soren had described as an old friend, someone he had grown up with in the Highland Territories before coming to Verrill. Aldrich was visiting for the month. He was tall and dark-haired and alpha in the way that Soren was alpha, filling rooms, managing the temperature of them, and he had looked at me since his arrival with the faint, polite assessment of someone trying to understand what they are looking at and finding the answer unsatisfactory. What I heard, standing in that corridor with my glass of water and my borrowed coat and my 8 months of believing I was allowed to have something good, was Soren's voice saying this: "I know it has been going on for longer than it should have. You have been patient with me. I need a little more time to handle the situation cleanly." Aldrich's voice, the situation being Cale. A pause. The particular quality of that pause was the sound of a man choosing his words, which meant the words that followed were more curated than honest. Soren said, "He does not have anyone else. I cannot simply walk him out. It needs to be managed." Another pause. Then Aldrich said, voice lower, "When?" And Soren said, "After the new year. I will have arrangements in place by then, something that looks like his choice rather than mine." I stood in that corridor for a long time after they moved away, long enough for the water in my glass to stop trembling, long enough for the noise of the party to sound very far away, as though it were happening in a different building, a different city, a different version of a world where I had never been foolish enough to believe that someone like Soren would look at someone like me and find something worth keeping. I went back to the apartment that night. I helped Soren clean up the last of the dinner things in the kitchen. I went to bed when he went to bed. I lay in the dark beside a man who was planning a clean exit, and I breathed very carefully, the way you breathe when you are trying not to let the person next to you know that something inside you has just broken irreparably. I waited 6 days. On the 7th day, while Soren was at a meeting that would take most of the afternoon, I packed a single bag. I took only what had been mine before him. The good coat I had made, my sewing kit, my mother's small silver thimble that had been in my pocket the day I left my father's house, and had been in my pocket every day since, a few books, the clothes I had brought with me 8 months ago. I left everything else, the nicer things, the things he had given me, or that had accumulated in the shared life we had been building together. I left all of it, because I did not want to take anything out of that apartment that I had not already owned before I understood what it was. I left a note on the kitchen table that said only, "I heard you. I hope Aldrich makes you happy. I do not want anything from you. Do not look for me." Then I walked out of the apartment in the mid-city district, and I did not look back, which I want to be clear about, because I have been the kind of person who looks back compulsively and hopefully and against all available evidence, and that day I did not. That day I walked straight, and I kept walking, and I took the northbound transit out of Verrill, without having decided consciously that I was doing it, only that I needed to be as far as possible from the version of myself who had spent 8 months believing I was allowed to have something good. The North was where I went. Not because I had a plan for the North. There was no plan. I had a little money saved, enough for transit and a few weeks of a rented room somewhere cheap, and I had the half-formed idea that I would find work in one of the Highland towns, alterations and tailoring. There was always work for skilled hands, and I would begin again. The version of beginning again that requires you to strip everything back down to the bones and start from first principles, because the life you had built was built on a foundation that had been compromised from the start. The Highland Transit took 2 days. I slept in the seat and ate from a bag of dry provisions I had bought at the Varl terminus, and I looked out the window at the landscape changing, the lowland flats giving way to hills, and then to the first of the mountains. And I felt the cold beginning even through the transit windows, the particular cold of the north, which has an entirely different character from lowland cold, which is social and communal, and softened by the presence of other bodies. Highland cold is solitary. It is the cold of altitude and silence, and it does not negotiate. I got off at a town called Keskar, which had been described in the transit guide as a mid-sized Highland settlement with established trade routes. What it was, in practice, was a collection of stone buildings arranged around a market square and largely closed up for the season. It was the deep end of autumn in the Highlands, which meant that the passes were becoming dangerous, and the permanent residents had turned their attentions inward to firewood and preserved food and the particular self-sufficiency of people who do not expect help from anywhere and have arranged their lives accordingly. I found a room. It was above a brewery, and it smelled strongly of fermented grain and weakly of something else I chose not to investigate. The landlord was a broad woman named Hess, who looked at me the way Highland people look at lowlanders, with a kind of resigned appraisal, and charged me 3 weeks in advance. I paid it. I asked about work. She told me there was a dry goods trader 2 streets over who had been complaining about his wife's anniversary coat being unwearable. I fixed the coat. He paid me fairly. He told his neighbor, who had a hem problem. I fixed the hem. I began to find my footing carefully, the way you find footing on ice, testing each step. I was there for 3 weeks when the storm came. In the Highlands, a serious storm does not come alone. It comes with a day of warning, a particular change in the quality of the air, a heaviness and a metallic taste, and the way animals become uneasy, and the light turns from gold to white to gray in the course of an afternoon. The Highland residents recognized this, and they prepared for it. They stocked their firewood. They checked their stores. They did not go out. I did not know how to read the warning. I had gone out in the early afternoon to deliver a finished coat to a farm 3 kilometers beyond the town, which seemed manageable when I left, and became something else entirely halfway there, when the first real wave of the storm came in off the mountain passes like a wall. The snow was not falling exactly. It was occurring. It was a horizontal, total, immediate condition, blinding and sharp and already accumulating, with a speed that turned the path I had walked on into a suggestion rather than a fact. I turned back. This was the correct decision, and I made it quickly, which is the only thing I did correctly in the next several hours. The path home was gone. Not metaphorically, not obscured and recoverable with careful attention. Gone, as in no longer distinguishable from the surrounding land, as in I was standing in a white, featureless world with no landmarks, and a wind that was so loud and so constant it had become a kind of silence, a wall of sound so total it stopped carrying information. I had no compass. I had no flint. I had the good coat, which was a very good coat, and which I had made with Highland wool and double-lined with flannel, and which was doing what I had designed it to do, which was delaying rather than preventing my death. I walked. I have no other way to describe the next several hours except to say that I walked in what I believed was the direction of the town, and the cold settled into me the way I described at the beginning, the patient, quiet kind, and my hands went first, and then my feet, and then the edges of my thinking, the parts that remembered why I was walking or what I was walking toward, until I was just a body moving through white because stopping seemed worse, and then my legs stopped making good decisions about where to put themselves, and I went down into the snow, and the snow received me without comment. I remember the smell before I remember anything else. Cedar and warm earth. The deep animal warmth of something very large and very alive. A sound, low and continuous, that I understood later, was a sound made in the chest of a wolf. Not a growl, but something beneath growling, something that functions in the Omegaverse the way certain sounds function in the body of a frightened creature, as a signal that it is safe, that the danger has passed, that there is no need to remain braced for the next blow. I did not understand it consciously. My body understood it before my mind had the resources to form an opinion. My body went very still and stopped fighting. I came back to consciousness in increments, over what felt like a long time, but was probably not. The first increment was warmth, overwhelming and total, the kind of warmth that hurts when you have been cold enough, that registers as pain because the nerves are awakening from something they had begun to believe was permanent. The second increment was scent, that same cedar and warm earth, but closer now, surrounding me, layered and complex, the scent of an alpha at rest, an alpha in his own territory, an alpha who was very close. The third increment was texture, something soft beneath me, something that shifted and breathed, and then I understood that I was lying against a chest, that two very large arms were around me, and that I was inside what felt like a nest. In the Omegaverse, nesting is not simply the act of gathering soft things into a comfortable arrangement. A nest is an expression of an alpha's biological instinct to create safety for another person, built from the alpha's own things, saturated with their scent, designed to envelop and calm an omega the way a den calms a frightened animal. A real nest, built properly by an alpha who knows what they are doing, is one of the most profoundly reassuring sensory environments that exists. The scent alone is enough to lower an omega's cortisol. The pressure and enclosure do the rest. Even an omega who has never experienced a properly built nest responds to it on an instinctual level that bypasses all their socialized caution. I had never been in a real nest before. What I discovered, lying in that nest with my hands slowly and painfully returning to life, and the storm howling outside at a great distance that felt like another world, was that everything I had ever read about nests was an understatement. It felt like being held by the concept of safety itself. It felt like the inside of a word that does not exist in the lowland dialects, a word that means both shelter and chosen, and here you are not alone. I opened my eyes. The space was large and low-ceilinged and lit by a single deep-burning lamp that threw amber light across stone walls hung with firs. The ceiling was vaulted, natural stone, and the floor was packed earth covered with layered hides. The nest was built against the far wall, an enormous construction of thick blankets and pelts and what appeared to be the dismantled contents of a Highland sleeping pallet, and I was inside it, and the arms around me belonged to a man who was very large and very warm, and currently asleep, which was the only reason I was not screaming. I very carefully, very slowly, turned my head enough to see him. He was unlike anyone I had encountered in the lowland city or the Highland town. He was built on a scale that I registered first as wrong, the way a mountain registers as wrong when you are standing at its base and realize it does not obey the proportions you had assigned to mountains from a distance. He was not merely large in the way of broad-shouldered alphas, though he was that too. He was layered, built for cold and endurance, with the particular density of a body that has spent its entire existence in the highlands doing physical work. His hair was dark, thick, worn loose around his shoulders. His face in sleep was younger than I expected. Not young exactly, but the lines in it were from weather and not from age, and his jaw was heavy, and his mouth was closed, and his brows were dark and strong, and his lashes were longer than seemed fair for someone who was probably capable of breaking a stone in half with his hands. He smelled like he had when he found me, cedar and warm earth, but more now, more complex, the way a fire smells more complex when you are close to it than when you smell it from a distance. And underneath those layers was the undeniable scent of an alpha in his prime, a scent that my omega instincts registered immediately and filed under. Pay attention to this. I did not move for a long time. My hands were still hurting as they warmed, and my feet were beginning the same painful process, and the rest of me was suspended in a state I could only describe as profound confusion about what had happened and why I was alive and who this person was. The storm was still audible, a deep continuous roar that pressed against the stone walls and was held at bay by them. The lamp burned. The man breathed slowly beside me. The nest held us both. Eventually, without my deciding to, I went back to sleep. When I woke the second time, he was awake and watching me. His eyes were gray, deep gray, the color of mountain sky just before the light changes, and they were direct in the way of Highland people, who do not use eye contact the way lowlanders do, as a social tool to be calibrated and deployed, but as a simple fact of attention. He was looking at me because I was there, and I was awake, and he wanted to see if I was all right. The assessment was thorough and without judgment, and strangely, given everything, it did not feel invasive. I said, "Where am I?" My voice was rough, which was what happened when a throat had been very cold and was now very warm, and I sounded considerably less composed than I wished. He said, "Safe." His voice was low, deliberate, with the particular cadence of someone for whom speech is a tool used carefully rather than constantly. I said, "I know that. I meant geographically." Something moved in his eyes that might have been the first ancestor of amusement. He said, "My home, east-facing slope of the Kell Range, 3 hours from Keskar in good weather." I said, "How did you find me?" He said, "Hunting." He paused. "You were mostly buried." Another pause. "You were very still." There was something in the way he said you were very still that I understood was not simply a description of my physical state. He was telling me how close it had been. He was telling me, without wanting to alarm me, because he had already determined from the assessment of my eyes that I was the kind of person who needed to understand the truth, but did not need it delivered as a blow. I said, "Thank you." He said, "You are welcome." Then, "Can you feel your hands?" I could, which was both good and very unpleasant in the way of returning circulation. I said, "Yes." He said, "And your feet?" I said, "Yes." "They hurt," he said. "That is correct. It means they are not lost." He helped me sit up then. His hands were careful and impersonal, the hands of someone who had some knowledge of cold injury and was checking the returns with professional attention. Nothing like the touch of an alpha managing an omega, which I had experienced enough to recognize its particular quality, the way it assumed permission, the way it made the omega's body the object of an alpha's attention rather than the subject of their own experience. This was not that. This was practical. This was someone assessing damage with the efficiency of a person who has needed to assess damage before. His name was Roan. I learned this when I asked, not because he volunteered it. He had the quality of a man who does not put information into the air that has not been requested. When I told him my name, he repeated it once, Cale, as though placing it in a location he would be able to find again, and then he nodded, and that was the end of the introduction. The storm lasted 2 more days. I will tell you what those 2 days were like, because they were unlike anything that had come before them in my life, and I want to get them right. Roan's home was built into the mountain, which I understood better once the shock and cold injury wore off enough for me to look at it properly. The main chamber was the one where the nest was, large and lamplit and stone-walled, with a hearth at one end that burned what appeared to be almost constantly, and a series of shelves along one wall holding provisions, tools, carefully maintained equipment for hunting and trapping, and the management of a life in the deep highland. Off the main chamber were 2 smaller rooms, one clearly used for storage and one for washing, where a cistern fed by an underground spring kept water cold but available. The whole structure had the quality of something built by someone who had been thinking about it for a long time, built for permanence, for endurance, built by someone who intended to be here for the rest of their life and wanted to be comfortable. Roan cooked. He did this with the same practical efficiency with which he did everything, producing from his stores a sequence of meals that were simple and very good, thick soups made from dried meat and roots, flatbread cooked on the hearthstone, preserved fruit that he offered in small measured quantities, as though aware it was a luxury and portioning it accordingly. He fed me with the attentiveness of someone who understood that cold injury depleted the body in ways that went beyond the immediate and required sustained input to address. He did not comment on how much I ate or suggest I should eat more. He simply made food available and replenished it when it was gone. He spoke in the way I was beginning to recognize as characteristic, not rarely, but deliberately. Sentences that contained exactly what needed to be said, and nothing supplementary. When I asked him questions, he answered them without elaboration unless elaboration seemed genuinely necessary. When he did not know the answer, he said so. When my questions touched on things that seemed to be personal, he considered them briefly, and then either answered or said, "I would rather not discuss that." Both responses were delivered with the same neutral calm, without defensiveness, or the social anxiety that usually accompanies a refusal to answer. I found this, unexpectedly, extraordinarily restful. I had spent 8 months in a relationship where every conversation was a performance of a kind, where I had been the audience for Soren's self-presentation and the performer of Call Who Is Grateful and Charming and Does Not Take Up Too Much Space. And before that, I had spent years alone, which had its own exhaustions, the exhaustion of being your own only company, of maintaining yourself entirely from within. What Roan offered, without intending to offer anything, was simply the experience of being in the same room as another person who was not performing anything and was not expecting a performance. On the first afternoon, I watched him repair a trap. He did this at the table in the main chamber with his back to the hearth, and his hands moved with the ease of someone doing something they have done so many times it no longer requires conscious attention. I found a piece of mending in my bag, a hem on one of my own shirts that had begun to go, and I sat on the other side of the table and worked on it, and we sat together for 2 hours doing our respective things in the amber light while the storm moved outside like something enormous trying to get in and failing. At one point, he looked up from the trap and looked at me for a moment, and then looked back down at what he was doing. I said, "What?" He said, "Nothing." Then, "You are good at that." I said, "I have been doing it since I was 9. Doing it." He said, "It shows." Then he went back to the trap. I want to tell you that this small exchange, which contained nothing, conveyed nothing, was nothing by any objective measure, produced in me a warmth in my chest that I recognized after a moment as the particular warmth of being seen doing something you are good at by someone who noticed without needing to comment on it, someone who said a true thing simply because it was true, and not because they needed you to feel a certain way about them for having said it. On the second day, my hands were better, and my feet were functional, and I had begun to feel the full dimensions of my situation, which were not exactly promising. I was 3 hours from the nearest town in conditions that made that town currently inaccessible, with a stranger who had no obligation to me beyond having declined to leave me in the snow, and no immediate plan, and a life in Keskar that had consisted of 3 weeks in a room, above a brewery, and a small accumulation of alterations work that would all have been disrupted by the storm. I told Rowan this, because it seemed important to be honest about the fact that I was in his space without his having invited me, and that I intended to leave as soon as conditions allowed. I said, "I want you to know that I will leave as soon as the path is passable. I am not expecting anything from you beyond what you have already given me." He listened to this with his characteristic attention. Then he said, "I know." I said, "I wanted to say it explicitly." He said, "I understood that from the beginning. You are welcome to stay until the weather turns." I said, "That is kind." He said, "It is not particularly kind. It would be unkind to send you out in this." There was a pause. Then I said, "Why did you bring me inside?" He looked at me. He said, "You were half dead in the snow." I said, "That is not what I meant. I meant that you could have gone to get help, gone to Keskar." He said, 3 hours away." I said, "Yes." He said, "You would have been dead in 40 minutes. There was nothing to say to this." He said, after a moment, "I do not leave people in the snow who can still be saved." He said it as though it were a statement of personal policy, a fundamental operating principle that did not require justification. I believed him. I believed him completely, and I understood, sitting across the table from this man in the amber light of the deep highland while the storm pressed against the stone outside, that I had arrived at a truth about him in the space of 2 days that I had never arrived at about Soren in 8 months. The truth was simply, this is a person who means what he says, who does what he says, who would not under any circumstances say to someone in the dark that they needed to handle the situation cleanly. On the evening of the second day, Roan put more logs on the fire, and we ate dinner, which was a thick stew that he had been building over the course of the afternoon, and afterward he produced from a high shelf a small clay bottle that turned out to contain a Highland spirit, clear and very strong, and he poured 2 small amounts into 2 cups and pushed one toward me without asking if I wanted it, which I found I did not mind because there are questions that do not need to be asked. The spirit was warm all the way down. I held the cup in both hands and looked at the fire, and I was aware of him across the table, in the way you are aware of someone when your attention is fully engaged even though you are not looking at them directly. I said, "How long have you lived here? Have you lived?" He said, 7 years. I said, "Alone?" A pause. He said, "Since the 4th year." I did not ask about the first 3. He had the right to that boundary, and I had learned by then that he would tell me what he wanted me to know. But he surprised me. He said, without being asked, "I was bonded. It did not last." I said, "I am sorry." He said, "It was a long time ago." I said, "That does not always help." He looked at me. He said, "No, it does not." Then, quietly, "You left someone." It was not a question. I said, "Yes." He said, "Recently?" I said, 2 weeks ago. He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I was going to find work in the Highlands. I have not thought further than that." He considered this. Then he said, "There is work here, if you need it. I do not mean to complicate your situation, only that if you need somewhere to be while you work out what comes next." I said, "What kind of work?" He said, "I trade in Highland goods, furs, preserved foods, specialty timber. The paperwork has become more than I can manage. The records for the trapping routes need to be rebuilt this winter. My writing is functional, but not good, and I have noticed that you sew at a level that would be useful for finishing garments for trade." I said, "You have noticed all of this in 2 days?" He said, "I notice things." Then, "It would pay fairly. You would have a room of your own and meals. It is not a permanent arrangement, only as long as you need it to be." I sat with this. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease, the roar dropping to something intermittent. The fire crackled. The spirit in my cup was still warm. I said, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "Because you need something to land on." Then, after a pause so long I had decided he was finished, and because you are good company. He said it with the same plainness with which he said everything, as a fact and not a flattery, and the warmth in my chest deepened into something I did not examine yet, only noted and allowed to exist without needing to be named. I said, "All right." He said, "All right." That was how I came to stay. The days that followed the storm had the quality of early winter light, clean and pale and very still. I woke each morning in the smaller chamber Roan had cleared for me, a room that was plain and good-smelling, and which I began slowly to make my own in the small ways that do not require ownership. A book on the shelf, my sewing kit on the table, my coat on the hook behind the door. The work he had described was real and considerable. 7 years of records existed in a form that was technically complete, but practically difficult to navigate. I spent the first week organizing them, cross-referencing the trapping routes with the seasonal records and trading accounts, constructing an index. It was the kind of detailed analytical work that my father would have called unsuitable for an Omega, and which I had always found deeply satisfying. Roan reviewed the system at the end of the first week. He read through the ledgers for a long time. Then he said, "This is considerably better than I expected." I said, "How much were you expecting?" He said, with that ghost of amusement that was his version of a full laugh, "Less than this." I found that I was smiling. That was somewhat surprising. The last several weeks had not included much smiling, and I had begun to wonder if I had misplaced the capacity for it. The sewing work was also real. Roan had furs and hides in various stages of preparation, and the process of turning them into tradable goods required skills that went considerably beyond his own. I worked on these in the mornings and evenings, learning the particular demands of Highland materials, which were different from the woven fabrics of lowland tailoring. Roan watched me work sometimes. He did not offer suggestions unless I asked, but when I asked, his knowledge was deep and specific and genuinely useful. We talked in the evenings over the fire, the way people who are living in close proximity begin to talk when the silence has become comfortable enough to break selectively. He told me about the Highland trading routes and their politics, the relationships between mountain communities and lowland markets. He asked me about tailoring, about the lowland fashion districts, about the way the trade worked in cities he knew only from the outside. He did not ask about Sorn. He did not press on the shape of the life I had come from. He received whatever I offered without requiring more. He was the easiest person to talk to that I had ever encountered, because he was never managing me toward a feeling. He just listened. He just talked. And then we would both go back to our respective work in the amber light, and the silence would settle back around us, which was the most comfortable silence I had ever been in. 3 weeks into the arrangement, Roan made his quarterly trip to Keskar. He told me the evening before, "I will be gone 2 days. You have enough provisions. The path is marked with cairns now that the first snow has settled." I said, "I know where the path is." He said, "I know you do. I am telling you in case you need to know where I am, not because I think you cannot manage without me." I said, "Thank you for making that distinction." He said, "It seemed important." It was. It was exactly the kind of thing Soren would never have thought to say. The 2 days he was gone were the most uncomfortable I had spent on the mountain, not because anything went wrong, but because the house was wrong without him. I worked, I ate, I slept. The same rhythms functioned perfectly well, and were all, without exception, thinner for his absence. He came back on the evening of the second day. He came through the door in a gust of cold air with his pack on his back and a wrapped parcel under one arm, and he stopped when he saw me at the table, and something in his face shifted in the way I had begun to notice, a settling, like a thing finding its level. He held out the parcel. I said, "What is this?" He said, "Thread, the good lowland kind." I asked the merchant in Keskar. He said the Highland twist is not right for the finer work you are doing. I thought it would be useful. Inside I found 4 different weights, exactly the range I had been missing. I said, "How did you know which weights?" He said, "I watched what you were working on." He said it plainly, as though there were nothing remarkable about it, as though paying close enough attention to someone's work to understand what they needed, and then quietly acting on that understanding, were a simple and ordinary thing. It was not a simple and ordinary thing. I said, "Thank you." He said, "You are welcome." He went to put away his pack. I sat at the table with the thread in my hands, and I accepted, quietly, what had been accumulating in me for weeks without my permission. The word that had no respectable explanation given the timing and circumstances, but which was sitting in my chest with the patient immovability of something that has decided it lives there. I was in love with Roan. I was in love with him, and I had no intention of saying so, because the timing was absurd, and because he had not given me any indication he felt similarly, had been consistently careful about the space between us, offering the warmth of his attention without ever crossing into territory that would require me to respond to it as something other than ordinary kindness. I told myself this very firmly. Then I made dinner, because it was my turn, and I was glad to have something to do with my hands. The 4th week brought the first serious cold, the deep settled cold of Highland winter proper, which does not announce itself dramatically, but simply arrives one morning in the quality of the light, and does not leave again until spring. Practically, this produced a narrowing. We spent more time near the hearth, which meant near each other. The evenings became longer and more interior, 2 people in amber light with the dark pressing at the windows. I noticed things about him I had not had the proximity to notice before. The way he read, moving his lips faintly over difficult passages without seeming aware of it. The way he drank his evening tea always from the same wide clay cup, with a small chip on the rim that he turned away from his mouth, a habit so ingrained it was no longer a decision. The way he looked at the fire sometimes when he thought I was not watching. A long, private look that had the quality of a man checking in with himself. And I noticed the way he looked at me. Not the direct assessment look, but the other kind, the peripheral kind. The look that happened when his attention moved to me between tasks, not because he had decided to look, but because his eyes went there. I filed this carefully in the section of my mind marked, "Do not act on this. You are not reliable about these things. You have been wrong before." Then came the 5th week, and something changed. I woke before dawn on a Tuesday with a heat warning. In the Omegaverse, omegas in suppressant-free periods receive a biological early signal before a heat arrives, a restlessness and a warmth in the skin, and a hypersensitivity to scent. I had been on lowland suppressants for 3 years. I had not brought them north. I had not expected to need them. I had not expected to be living in a small stone dwelling with an unmated alpha. I went to the main chamber. Roan was already there with his morning tea. He looked up when I came in, and then he looked at me more carefully, and I understood from the shift in his eyes that he already knew. Alphas notice heat warnings in omegas before the omega is sometimes fully aware themselves. The scent changes. He said, "How long?" I said, 2 days, I think. Maybe less. He said, "Do you have suppressants?" I said, "No. I left Varl quickly." He said, "I can go to Keskar today. There is a physician there who keeps them." I said, "The path is 3 hours. The cold is significant." There was a pause. We were both aware, in the way of alphas and omegas who have been in close proximity long enough to have built up a significant charge of mutual recognition, that what was happening in the room had a weight extending beyond the practical question of suppressants. I said, "Roan." He said, "Yes." I said, "You do not have to go to Keskar." A long pause. He set his cup down. He said, "What are you saying?" I said, "I am saying that I have been in this house for 5 weeks, and I have learned enough about you in that time to trust you more than I have trusted anyone in a long time. And I am saying that I would rather spend this heat here with you than manage it alone in Keskar with suppressants from a physician who does not know me." His expression did not change outwardly, but the quality of the stillness in him changed. The way a held breath is different from a resting breath. He said, "That is a significant thing to say." I said, "I know. I have been not saying it for 5 weeks." He said, "I have been not saying something for 5 weeks also." I said, "I know." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I need you to understand something before you decide. When I bond fully. I am not made for partial arrangements or temporary ones. If I spend your heat with you, it will not be a transaction for me. It will be the beginning of something I will want to keep. So if you are uncertain, or if you are making this decision, because the heat is influencing you and not because you actually want this, then I need you to go to Keskar. I will take you myself, and I will make sure you are safe. But I need you to decide clearly, and not in a state where your body is choosing for your mind." I looked at him. I thought about Soren, who had never in 8 months said anything that required that level of honesty, or that much care for my actual interior state. I said, "I have wanted this since the 2nd morning I woke up here. Before any heat warning. Before any of this week. I want to be clear about that." He held my gaze for a moment that had the quality of something being confirmed, some final accounting completed. Then he stood, crossed the room, and put his hands on either side of my face with the care of someone handling something that matters, and he said, "All right." What followed was unlike anything I had experienced before, not because of the heat itself, though the heat was what it was, but because of the quality of his presence in it. He was thorough, in the way he was thorough about everything, attentive to details, responsive to information, continuously present in a way that had nothing to do with the biology and everything to do with the fact that he was, constitutionally, someone who paid full attention to whatever he was doing, and he communicated during closeness with the same economy and precision with which he communicated during everything else, saying what he needed, and asking what he needed to know. This was, unexpectedly, the most intimate quality of the entire experience. The sense of being with someone fully present and not performing anything. The heat lasted 3 days. During those 3 days there were long hours of sleep and food that Roan made and brought without being asked, and the warmth of his nest rebuilt around us both, and conversations in the quiet times between, easy and unguarded in the way conversations become when ordinary social caution has been set down and forgotten. He told me about the bond that had failed, his first and only, with an Omega from the lowland cities who had come north for a season, and decided, after 3 years, that the Highland life was not what she had thought she wanted. He told me about the 4th year alone on the mountain, which was the hardest year of his life, survived by working until he was too tired to feel anything except tiredness. He told me about the gradual way the mountain had become not a consolation for the life he had lost, but simply home. I told him things I had not told anyone, about my father's silences and what they had built in me, the particular architecture of a person who learns early that their presence is an imposition and spends decades trying to occupy as little space as possible, about the way I had loved Soren with the completeness of someone who had been waiting their whole life for permission to love something, which meant that when it was taken away, it did not feel like the loss of a person, but the loss of the permission itself. Roan listened to all of this. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are allowed to want things." I said, "I know that intellectually." He said, "I know. I am saying it because I want you to hear it from outside your own head. You are allowed to want things. You are allowed to have them. Something in my chest, something old and structural and long calcified, shifted quietly, like a stone in a wall, deciding after a long time to settle into a different position. On the 4th morning, I woke, and the heat had passed, and Roan was asleep beside me in the nest, and the lamp was burning low, and the fire had gone to coals, and the whole world outside the nest was dim and quiet and perfectly still. I lay there, with the tentative curiosity of someone who has arrived somewhere surprising and wants to know what the place is like. Roan woke. He looked at me and said, "How are you?" I said, "Good, genuinely good. That is not a social answer." He said, "I know the difference by now." Then I said, "You said when you bond fully, and you will not be able to pretend otherwise afterward. I want you to know that I am not asking you to pretend. I am not going anywhere." He said, "I know. I knew before you said it." He paused. "I am a person who notices things." I laughed. It came out more freely than I expected, and the sound of it in the stone chamber surprised us both. He looked at the laugh with the attention he gave everything, and then something in his face opened, the real thing, deep and warm and entirely unguarded. Not the ghost of amusement. The actual thing underneath. The face this man wore when he was happy. I stored it in the place in my mind where I keep things I intend to keep. We did not make declarations that morning. We got up. We rebuilt the fire. Roan made breakfast, and we ate at the table in the morning light with the mountain outside, bright and white and enormous, and it was ordinary, and it was right, and neither of us needed to say so. This is not to say that nothing difficult came. Nothing good is earned without the thing that tries to take it from you. 6 weeks after that morning, in the deep belly of Highland winter, I came back from outside the dwelling to find a man standing at the door of the stone house on the mountain. He was dressed in lowland clothing, inadequate for the cold. He had dark auburn hair and amber eyes, and he smelled of pine resin, and something I had spent 8 months believing was warmth, and now understood was only its surface. Soren. He turned when he heard my footsteps on the snow, and his face went through relief, and something more complicated behind it, and he said, "Kale. Thank God. I have been looking for you for 2 months." I stood in the snow and looked at him, and I felt nothing I had expected to feel. Not the rush of complicated love and grief I had imagined on the transit north. Not the anger underneath it. Not even the residual tenderness I had worried might ambush me. What I felt was a very clean and very complete absence of the thing that had once been there. Like walking into a room where something was kept, and finding the room empty, and realizing the thing has been gone long enough that the room does not remember it. I said, How did you find me? He said, the transit records, and then Keskar. The woman at the inn remembered you. I said, that must have taken considerable effort. He said, yes. You left a note that said, do not look for me. I said, yes. He said, I looked for you anyway. I said, I know. You are standing in front of me. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, Cale, I made a mistake. What you heard that night with Aldrich, it was not what it sounded like. I was trying to manage his expectations. He had been pressing me for months, and I said things I did not mean because I did not know how to tell him directly that I was not available, that you were not a situation to be managed, that you were the person I actually wanted. I know how it sounded. I know why you left. But I came here to tell you that I was wrong, and I am sorry, and I want to start again. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about how these words would have landed 6 months ago, standing in that corridor in Varl with a glass of water and 8 months of believing. They would have been the thing I most wanted to hear. They would have reorganized my world. I said, Soren, I believe you that you made a mistake. I believe you that you are sorry. And I want you to understand that I am telling you the truth when I say that none of that matters to me now. His face changed. He said, What? I said, I left because I heard something true. You were handling me. You were managing me like a situation. Whether or not you loved me alongside that, the managing was real. I was a situation that needed to be handled cleanly. I heard that in your voice. And the reason it hurt was not just because of Aldrich. It was because it confirmed something I had been trying not to know, that the way you loved me required me to stay small enough to be manageable. Soren was very still. I said, I am not small here. Not. I do not think I was ever actually small. I think I was trying to fit inside the space available in your life, and that space had a ceiling I kept bumping against and could not understand. Here, the ceiling is the sky. The door of the stone house opened behind me. I did not need to look to know who it was. I felt him the way I had learned to feel him, the cedar and warm earth scent carrying even in the cold, the particular quality the air took on when Roan was present. He stepped out into the snow and stood beside me. Not in front of me, not between me and Soren. Beside me. The position of someone who trusts the person they love to handle what is theirs to handle and is simply present in case that person wants company. Soren looked at him, then back at me. Something moved through his face that I recognized as the moment of understanding, not just the surface facts of the situation, but the texture of it, the particular quality of what was between Roan and me that was visible even standing in the snow, even in a moment of confrontation. Soren said, How long? I said, Long enough. He looked at Roan for a moment. Roan looked back with the gray mountain sky eyes and said nothing, which was the correct response, the response of a man who had nothing to prove and no performance to give. Soren said to me, Is this what you want? I said, Yes. He said, Then I hope it is good to you. His voice had lost the argument in it. What was left was something genuine. He had loved me in the way he was capable of loving, which was not the way I needed to be loved, but was not nothing. He had made a mistake and tried to correct it, and the correction arrived too late, and now he was going to have to turn around and go back down the mountain alone. I said, I hope you find what you're looking for. I mean that. He nodded once. He turned. He walked back down the mountain path, his footprints filling slowly in the light wind, and I watched him until the path curved and took him out of sight. Roan said, Are you all right? I said, Yes. Genuinely. That is not a social answer. He said, I know the difference by now. I looked at him. He was watching me with the full attention and the expression of a man who is checking that something he cares about is intact and finding it intact and allowing himself quietly to be relieved. I said, I told him I live here now. Roan said, You do. I said, I know. I was telling him, not asking you. He said, I know. I was confirming, not giving permission. There was a moment. Then I stepped closer and put my arms around him, and he put his arms around me, and we stood in the snow in front of the stone house on the mountain, while the cold pressed against us from outside, and the warmth of him was real and immediate and mine. He said, into the top of my head, "You said the ceiling here is the sky." I said, "I did." He said, "That is true." The winter deepened around us after that, and then, in the slow, relentless way of seasons, began eventually to turn. We worked through it. The records, the roots, the hides, the thread, the trading runs. Roan's output for the season was the best it had been in 3 years. The finished garments I produced sold well in Keskar, the Highland craftsmanship combined with lowland finishing technique, making something the merchant described as the best work he had seen come down from the mountains. One evening in late winter, when the light was staying longer, and the fire required less wood than it had at the deepest point of the season, Roan looked up from the route map he was examining and said, "There is something I want to ask you." I said, "Ask." He said, "I want to bond with you, formally, marked. This is not a practical question or a transactional one. I am asking because you are the person I want to be bonded to, because I have known that for longer than I said it, and because I do not want there to be any ambiguity about what I am asking or what it means to me." I put down the ledger I was working on. I looked at him across the table in the amber light, and I thought about the note I had left on a kitchen table in Varl, and the snow, and the cedar, and warm earth smell, and the nest, and the thread, and Soren's footprints filling in the snow, and this man who said things precisely and meant them completely. I said, "I have known I wanted that for longer than I said it either." He said, "Then we are agreed." I said, "We are agreed. There was no ceremony. We were not people who needed ceremony." That evening, in the nest built from Roan's things and saturated with his scent, and which I had come to think of simply as home, he marked me, and I marked him, and the bond settled between us with the quiet completeness of something that has been moving toward this point for a long time, and has finally arrived. Not a dramatic arrival. The simple, clean arrival of a thing that has been allowed to develop at its own pace, and has become exactly what it was always going to be. The mark he left was high on my shoulder, where I could feel it when I turned my head. The mark I left was at the juncture of his throat and shoulder, where his pulse lived, and I pressed my lips against it afterward and felt the pulse beating under my mouth, steady and even and certain, which was the most accurate description of Roan himself that I could offer. The Highland spring arrived properly in the 2nd month after the bonding, with the particular assertiveness of a season that has been patient long enough. The snow retreated up the mountain faces. The stream in the valley below ran clear and fast with snowmelt. We went to Keskar together for the spring trading run, both of us for the first time. The merchant's wife looked at us across the counter and said, "I told him." I said, "Told him what?" She said, "That you had someone at home." She looked at Roan. She said, "Is that true?" He said, "He was mostly buried." His voice was grave. She shook her head at him in the fond, resigned way of someone who has known a person long enough to have made peace with how they are, and she gave us a very good price on the supply order. On the walk back up the mountain in the late afternoon light, I said, "She told him you had someone at home before you came back with the thread." He said, "I know. I had been thinking about what you needed." I said, "You went to Keskar to trade and spent part of it thinking about my thread weights, while thinking about whether to tell me something." He stopped walking. He turned and looked at me, with the gray mountain sky eyes in the late afternoon light, and said, "I think I had already decided. I was just not ready to say it yet." I looked at him. At this man who had found me half dead in the snow, and carried me into his home, and wrapped me in the warmth of his nest, and checked my hands, and fed me, and given me work, and given me space, and given me time, and gone to a market town, and thought about my thread weights, while deciding whether to say the thing he had already decided, who had never once made me feel like a situation that needed to be managed cleanly. The ceiling is the sky, the mark on my shoulder, the fire always burning. I said, "I knew before you said it too." He said, "We are a pair of people who know things before we say them." I said, "That will require us to say them anyway, sometimes, so the other person knows we know." He considered this with his characteristic seriousness. Then he said, "I love you." He said it the same way he said everything, directly, plainly, as a fact reported from the world. Not decorated, not managed. True, I said, "I love you." Same way. Because it was true, and because he deserved to hear it out loud and not just know it. We stood on the mountain path in the early highland spring, with the cold still in the air, and the green things pushing up through the ground, and the stone house somewhere above us with the fire laid and waiting, and the bond between us warm and settled and real, and neither of us said anything else for a while because nothing else was needed. My mother's thimble lives on the shelf above my sewing table now. I see it every morning when I sit down to work. It has been in my pocket every day from the day I left my father's house to the day I arrived at this one. It does not need to be in my pocket here. Here it can rest. That is the whole of it, or the beginning of it, which are sometimes the same thing. A man half dead in the snow, a nest, the smell of cedar and warm earth, the particular long road between the life you survive and the life you are allowed to have. The fire is still burning. The mountain is still here. The ceiling is the sky. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe. It truly helps the channel grow. My beautiful heaven angels, tell me your thoughts in the comments. Which part did you like the most, and where can I improve? I love reading and replying to your comments. It means the world to me. Let's meet again next time with a better story. Until then, I hope you all have a great time.